As Simon said, one of the things that we struggle with, one of the things that we see very continually is an addiction, right, in technology. This is nothing new. We've seen this play out any number of times in the technology industry in the past, and what we're seeing now is no different. Okay. So when we think about what the state of the cloud is today, I'm assuming that, given the audience and given that I know actually many of you in the room, you guys are relatively up to speed, and also given the fact that I only have 20 minutes. We're not going to go through every standard. We're not going to go through every initiative to try to ensure interoperability. But basically what we have is a world where everyone has a cloud. And when I say everyone has a cloud, I'm not talking strictly about vendors. Yes, Google, Salesforce, Microsoft, and so on down the line. Everybody has their own cloud. Everybody has their own cloud implementation. But increasingly what we're seeing is that private enterprises and even governments in many cases also have their own cloud. What these clouds typically have in common is that one cloud does not work with another cloud. It's not terribly complicated. Do we have batteries for? Okay, hang on, now I got to go back. In addition to a cloud, everybody has an API. If you go out and talk with many of the vendors, about the issue of interoperability, one of the first things they come back with is, hey, we have an API, and that API is open. And it's very much a categorical imperative type of problem. On a one-off basis, if all you have to deal with is one vendor, that's a great answer. Hey, they have an API. Hey, this API is open and documented, and I can operate and interoperate effectively with the cloud because of this API. But what happens if I'm consuming multiple clouds? Do I need to track the evolution? Do I need to track, the way that these APIs evolve over time? That's really just a non-starter proposition, for many of the folks that are going to be the end users and the consumers of clouds, which is in fact driving, a lot of the private adoption, that we see. It's also driving the innovation around. How many of the folks in the room are familiar with the Delta Cloud project? Okay, a handful of you. Delta Cloud, for those of you who haven't seen it, is essentially an abstraction layer that sits above APIs. And it exists. Why? Because everybody has an API. And everybody has an angle, right? Everybody is coming at the cloud to advantage, their own business and their own position, really as they should. So in other words, if you deal with Force.com, one of the things that Force.com will pitch you, aside from the fact that they have a proprietary language, proprietary infrastructure, although the relationship with VMware changes that, is the fact that they have data, right? They have simplified access to all the data that you might be storing on Salesforce.com. It's a very interesting angle. Microsoft's Azure Cloud has its own angle, from a Microsoft development perspective. Google App Engine, same thing, and so on. Everybody has an angle. What no one has is portability. Really, this is the addiction that Simon speaks of. And the addiction is a very, very strong and very, very difficult, thorny problem to solve in the industry, because the fact is that enterprises are more than willing to lock themselves in, and they do it over and over and over again. And and certainly those of us in the industry do a lot of commentary and a lot of editorials about why this is bad and all of the risks of this approach. In the grand scheme of things, this doesn't make a difference. What most businesses want to do is solve a problem, and they will use the simplest and easiest tool to solve that problem. And the way that we put it, when we talk to customers about this, is that most of the folks that we deal with are willing to trade tomorrow's problems for a solution tomorrow. It really is that simple. It's not terribly complicated. So when we think about the cloud, the risks here are very apparent. And I was late to the session because I didn't get in until 3 in the morning. But I'm sure this issue has come up many times in the talks today, and you'll hear it many more times. That the cloud environments, in terms of the incompatibilities between them, really ensure at this point that you're locked in. Even infrastructure as a service, which looks very, very much like the data center environments that we all know and we're all familiar with, there are slight differences. So if I'm implementing, for example, in Amazon, and I'm doing some specific things in terms of how I interface with S3, it's a little bit different than what I would do at home. So really, at even very, very fundamental layers of infrastructure, we have incompatibility. So, when we step back from the cloud, when we step back from what we all know, what we're here to talk about, how do technology markets evolve? And the answer is really, on a high level, it's really pretty simple. This is not complicated, and you can go back, and we've seen this play out over and over and over again. Right? We have a period of innovation. We have a period where there's rapid innovation in a particular category. And when we talk later on today, as we will, and I hope many of you attend the panels this afternoon because some of them look really, really pretty good, about the issues of standards and about the crux of innovation and when in a market we standardize, when we get to the consolidation, when we get to expansion. There are very, very different definitions of how this works and how we transition from one of these stages to the next, right? So when we think about the cloud, we could, right now, sit down and standardize many of the APIs that we need, whether that's storage, identity, provisioning, and so on. The difficulty is that, the industry is really a couple years old. Really, the date back, apart from the fundamental technologies, of course, are, in many cases, decades old. But in terms of the offerings themselves and what we've seen, they really date back about 5 years, probably not even, at least on a volume basis. In the technology industry, yes, that's a long time, but in terms of this market, there's a long way to go. So at what point do we transition from innovation, to a period of consolidation? Consolidation occurs at that crux point where we say, okay, you know what, we've innovated sufficiently. We don't need to innovate nearly as quickly, so let's standardize. Let's fix the way that we're going to do certain tasks, fix the way that we're going to do certain things, so we can all agree. And now we can move on to consolidation. Now we can move on to a period, where we have fewer startups doing lots of different things, and consolidation. And we saw this play out in the Java industry. And we saw a lot of the Java startups, for example, get acquired. A lot of these startups ended up being acquired by BEA, by IBM, by Oracle, by Sun, and so on. That's the market period that we will head into within probably a year or two, simply because this is the way that, this has all happened before, this will all happen again. And then at some point, we'll get to the period of expansion. We'll get to the period where competition is reignited, amongst a smaller set of very, very empowered players who see market opportunities. Come on. Come on. All right, one last time. No. All right, I think the battery may be... All right. Well, what's the problem with the cloud? The problem is that, as you've seen in the next slide, which I now can't get back to, the problem with the cloud is that it's very early, right? We just don't have an opportunity to sit down and agree on some of the... All right, skip to the next one. Come on. All right. So yes, it's early. Yes, we don't have the opportunity to sit down and go through many of the opportunities for standardization, simply because we can't sit down and agree because we're still iterating too quickly. But the bigger problem, and this is where the addiction comes in, and this is the most important takeaway, hopefully that all of you walk out of here with, is that we have a fundamental, far-reaching misalignment between customer needs and vendor needs. They just don't work. So we had a conversation with a vendor a couple years ago talking about their opportunities in the cloud space. This is a systems vendor, presumably would have been interested in this type of infrastructure. They were not. Why? The comment was, I don't want to be in the hosting business. All right, so when we examine the relationships between different variables, when we look at technology markets, when we have revenue versus margin, the fact is that for many of the infrastructures as service offerings we're talking about right now, they're exceedingly low margin businesses, right? So this is why when you see, for example, IBM or HP or any of the other large system providers talk about cloud and talk about their cloud offerings, They're not talking about cloud in the same way, for example, that Amazon is. Why? Because that's not a real high-margin business. It's not the kind of business that larger systems players are interested in. And why is that? Well, it's because there's a relationship between two other variables, that we're here to talk about: lock-in and profitability. All right, so in the statistics world, and in various other math worlds that I'm sure we're all familiar with, basically what we're looking for is a relationship between variables. Right? And again, when we look at the history, and we look at the history of the industry, and we look at how these things play out over time, this plays out again and again and again. As lock-in goes up, profitability goes up. As lock-in goes down, profitability goes down. Right? So there's been a debate, the past several weeks, well, actually past several years, but it reignited in the past couple weeks on open core as a business model and open source. And one of the arguments is that we haven't seen a billion-dollar open source company. Red Hat's the closest, about $750 million in revenue. Why haven't we seen a billion-dollar company? Because it's very, very difficult to duplicate the profit margins that we have seen historically when you don't have that fundamental lock-in. So this poses a problem clearly for the cloud because vendors don't want to be locked in, and that is at this point throttling adoption. But the vendors, generally speaking, aren't stupid, and they know the history, right? So they're, in many cases, we'll talk to vendors, and they are actively at war with themselves. They're actively in conflict internally, because on the one hand, they recognize that the threat of lock-in is a huge impediment to adoption and a huge obstacle to adoption. On the other hand, they know the history. They understand the correlation between lock-in and profitability. So IBM, way back in the mainframe days, pioneered this, right? Basically when, they made the systems and you got all of your software effectively from them, apart from applications, there was a lot of lock-in and that was a lot of control. And that returned significant profitability, for that firm. Microsoft has learned this lesson. Microsoft, in fact, benefited from some of the lock-in, that we had seen previously, and then just recreated lock-in in a different fashion with their operating system and Office business units. But along comes the cloud, and all of a sudden Windows is losing. For the first time in a long time, it's not only not the dominant player from a platform perspective, it's really not even in the top 2 or 3. This is new. So what will they try to accomplish with their cloud offering? Well, they'll try to replicate some of the lock-in. They'll try to replicate some of the advantages they currently enjoy in the operating system market. Where you're writing to a platform, it's very difficult to migrate away from that platform, and profitability accrues to that. And we're even seeing it in some surprising areas. So Amazon Web Services, and not to pick on anybody from Amazon who may be in the room, but Amazon is kind of in conflict here, right? So we see this, for example, with their API. We've had a couple conversations with large businesses that want to work with Amazon Web Services, want to consume the API. Their commentary, generally speaking, their reply when they look at the terms of service that Amazon's API is available under, is that it is not an option for big businesses. So we have small businesses, lots of them, the Eucalyptuses and RiceGales and so forth of the world, that are going forth and embracing Amazon's API and pushing it, in fact, towards a de facto standard status. But for a big business, they can't embrace it because the royalty terms are not clear. Why aren't they clear? Because Amazon, again, has this same conflict that we have seen play out in any number of other industries and other examples before, where the customer needs and the vendor needs are fundamentally not aligned. So, what's our best hope for change when we think about this addiction problem that we have? And when we think about this addiction problem that all customers are going to have as they look towards the cloud, as they look towards cloud services, what's the answer? And the answer is, quite apropos, actually, did I skip it? Yeah. So the answer is a project that doesn't care about lock-in. And that seems kind of weird, when you think about it in the vendor context. And many of the conversations, most of the conversations, in fact, that we see around the cloud are vendor related. Why is that? Because they're intrinsically vendor based. All of the clouds that we're talking about are based out of large companies, for the most part, Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and so on. And why is that? It's because hardware costs money. Running that infrastructure is not a trivial occupation, to put it mildly. So the best mechanism for aligning the user needs is this. It's very simple. And I don't mean to imply that this is the answer to all ills, right? Because it's not. There's no doubt about it. But when we think about what powers adoption, when we think about what makes open source successful, right, it's that it removes the threat of lock-in. Why, for example, have Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP, all these open source projects been so successful historically? They've been successful precisely because they do not lock users in. They get around, they reverse the fundamental problem, that we have, from a lock-in and adoption standpoint. Now, I can move, and it's not always trivial, of course, I can move from Ubuntu to Novell to Red Hat. Again, there are differences, certainly, particularly in an application compatibility perspective, but I can move. I'm not locked into one platform. Because basically in the open source world, as soon as you attempt to lock in, the adoption is going to go down, inevitably. And we see this play out over and over and over again in the open core debate. So what does this mean from a cloud perspective? Well, it means that when we look at the future of adoption and the future of what we're going to see in terms of software platforms, in the cloud space, it's probably not going to come from the proprietary players. Which is not to say that Azure and Force.com and so on aren't going to be wildly adopted platforms. They will be, because there are angles and because there are specific reasons to use these. But to get the kind of adoption that we all hope for, that we all strive for, we're going to need to provide end users and customers some assurance that they won't be locked in. The simplest way to do that is to make sure it's open source software. To make sure that, if at the end of the day you're dissatisfied with a given public provider, you can take that environment back and run it yourself if you choose to, if that happens to be the best decision for you. Now, what is the software going to be composed of? The market has yet to tell us. We obviously have a lot of cloud assets, right? We have specific cloud-oriented projects, Cloud.com, Eucalyptus, and the recently launched OpenStack, from Rackspace. So there's a lot of very, very specific targeted cloud assets. But there are a lot of other moving pieces at play here. From provisioning software like Chef and Puppet, to a variety of the operating system and virtualization layers that make this up. So we're going to see a future of open source software in the cloud, or at least we will, if clouds prove to be a primary and preferred adoption mechanism. Because at the end of the day, it's one thing to be locked into a software platform. It's a totally different proposition altogether to be locked into a platform that dictates your hardware, dictates your software, and dictates all of the choices to you. So that's how we cure addiction. And with that, I will pass it back to Simon.